Good. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second of our BNG clinics. In fact, this is following hot on the heels of our previous clinic that we held. I think it was in July, but it had some really positive feedback from that. And I think it really shows the value, the importance that people are putting to this topic. So today our clinic is going to be based on delivering biodiversity net gain on site. And we've got a really good panel to talk about this today. So just introduce our panel. So we've got Melissa Arthur. Melissa's the Group Biodiversity Manager for Persimmon Homes. And Melissa is an ecologist as well, so can help us with queries around that. Nick White, very pleased to have Nick supporting. Nick's from Natural England. Has been, as I said, strong support of the hub, really helping us and other developers get ready for biodiversity net gain. And obviously Nick's role and responsibility is actually broader than just BNG. He's looking at BNG biodiversity and natural capital as well for Natural England. And we've also got Alex Pelton, and Alex is the Group Biodiversity Manager at Barratt Developments. Again, very experienced in biodiversity net gain, having also worked in consultancy on a number of public and private sector projects as well. So welcome to our panel. Just before we sort of hand over to the panel and the presentation, I just want to sort of run through a little bit about the purpose of what we're trying to do today. So I suppose that the purpose of the clinics is very core to what we're doing at the Future Homes Hub, and really our role is here just to bring the sector together to share the expertise of members within the Future Homes Hub, and using that expertise enable us to meet the environmental and sustainability goals set out in the delivery plan and the roadmap for the sector. So here today we're obviously core focus on biodiversity net gain, which is being introduced mandatory BNG in November. And what we're really hoping to achieve is to support our smaller members, so particularly aimed at smaller developers or those just with less experience and knowledge around biodiversity net gain, using those who have a little bit more experience. So particularly, as I said, Melissa and Alex, and feeding on expertise from Nick. So it's very much focused around sort of our smaller developers. The last clinic we held, we actually found that quite a lot of technical questions came in around the metric, and whilst we can possibly answer a few of those, it's not really the forum for that. It's about the sort of practical issues and the challenges that developers are experiencing or will experience when working with biodiversity net gain mandatory BNG that comes in. So with that in mind, though, it's your session. We haven't really prepared much more apart from an introductory presentation that Melissa will be giving very shortly. So what I'd like you to do is send in any questions you've got on the topic of biodiversity net gain and how we can deliver it on site. We've got in the Zoom call the Q&A function. If you can put your questions in that Q&A chat, and we'll sort of run through and answer as many of those as we can do. We did ask for a couple of questions or any questions in advance. We've received a couple, so I'll be running through those as well. But as Melissa does her presentation, or as the conversation goes on, just put your topics in the chat, in the Q&A function, I mean, and we'll be able to answer them from there. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Melissa, who can introduce the subject, and then we can have a bit of a discussion around it afterwards. Okay, Melissa.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you, Richard. Okay, I'll just quickly share my screen. Bear with me a second. Okay, so can you all see that?
We've got it. Thank you. Yeah.
Perfect. Brilliant. Okay. So good. Obviously, good morning. It's really good to be here with everyone and in a place that we can share knowledge and experience. It's really good. So as Richard said, my name's Melissa Arthur. I do have a little bit of a croaky voice at the moment, but hopefully I'll hold out throughout the session because it comes and goes, but I'm sure we'll be fine. So I'll take you through a short presentation looking at what is on-site BNG, how this is measured, and some good practice principles around delivery and monitoring, with lots of questions, with lots of time for a Q&A session. So let's dive in. So when we talk about on-site BNG, this is land within the boundary of a project. And in a planning context, this usually means within your red line boundary, with on-site gains referring to habitat creation or enhancement that is measurably better compared to before the development. And when we talk about measurably better, the metric looks at habitat size, habitat distinctiveness, which refers to how important or rare that habitat is, habitat condition, which is set by a standard criteria, and strategic significance, which refers to basically contributions to the local biodiversity priorities. And it's really easy to get swept up into the metric. You know, the metric says this, it says that, but it's important to remember that the BNG metric, it is a tool. It's there to forecast and then evidence if you can achieve your gain and to what percent. So most of us know that nature makes its own rules, really. So there is a certain element of uncertainty when creating or enhancing habitats. So the metric deals with this by applying risk multipliers, and these take into account, first of all, difficulty, and that refers to the uncertainty in full delivery. Then we've got temporal risk, which represents the average time in years it takes to get from creation or enhancement to that target condition. And then we have spatial risk. Now, this actually does only apply to offsite. I'm quite conscious we're just talking about on-site today, but it's still worth knowing, and that's proximity to site. So if you are using off-site land, where does that land sit within the context of your development? And the whole spirit of BNG is, you know, to kind of achieve better outcomes for nature. So, you know, to do that properly, it's really important that BNG forms part of all development stages, right from as early as possible, right through to that operational use. So we'll have a brief look at these 4 touch points and application of that BNG of the BNG design principles. So when you're scoping out sites, considering BNG at the earliest opportunity will help you understand your baseline scores. And the earlier you're able to understand those, the more BNG can be positively influential in your design strategy. And you can see from the variation of baseline habitat value in the example on the screen. And your value very much depends on, as we've already talked about, habitat type, the condition of that habitat, and strategic significance. And knowing that will actually help determine your developable areas, you know, identifying any high value habitats and how much on-site gains you might actually be able to achieve. And as part of the scoping stage, knowing the local policy is really important because, you know, I'm sure if some of you have experienced some adopted and emerging policies do require more than that minimum 10% gain. And it's not just the biodiversity policies we need to look out for, it's other local policies as well. You know, for example, access to nature, you know, that does need to be considered alongside BNG. Some areas that will be subject to heightened activity may not always align with those higher habitat condition scores. A big one is being aware of that all-important anti-trash date. So the Environment Act makes specific provision to prevent landowners degrading the value of land before applications. Being mindful of your survey timings. I mean, we're quite used to this in the ecology world, but your condition scores for your habitats, for some habitat types at least, can only be gathered from ground surveys undertaken at the appropriate time of year. That's not to say that you can't go out at differing times of the year, but if you do that, you will need to support that with the data from the appropriate time of year. And what's also important to understand here is if there are any options available to you locally to deliver off-site, but of course that's once you've exhausted all on-site options, you know, and certainly as the off-site market matures, your options might be quite limited, and therefore that might influence how you approach your on-site gains. Design-wise, you know, of course, apply that knowledge gained at the scoping stage and the early use of the BNG metric to guide your decision making. You know, it's all about smart, creative design, minimising impact, and working with the right people to understand habitats, habitat function, and how the metric works. Again, we're all quite used to applying the mitigation hierarchy, and you'll need to evidence that how this has been followed or how this has been adhered to through your planning applications. So it's really important that you demonstrate that that's been followed. And as part of your scoping stage, you should have a really good understanding of your site. And this, of course, will help you to achieve those best outcomes for biodiversity. Designing in your key ecological findings, focusing development on those lower distinctiveness habitats, and enhancing the habitat assets that you've got on your site. You know, so when we talk about those assets, we're talking about high value habitat, strategically significant habitat, and any other locally policy driven habitat. And designing in mitigation for existing obligations. So of course, it's important to remember that BNG doesn't override those. And having said all of that, you know, it's still a case of, you know, being realistic about on-site delivery. You know, we need to think about the habitats that you're proposing. You know, do they suit the ground conditions? What are our site activity levels going to be? You know, and thinking about those disturbance pressures, because they may determine the level of habitat condition that you're targeting or that you're able to target. Customers' opinions, they're of course vital when we're dealing with development, you know, and that can be quite regionally different as well. So understanding what your customers' opinions are is really important. And consider habitat size and that ecological function of that habitat as well. So the small areas, you know, don't always align with the criteria to reach those higher condition targets. So again, it just enforces that realism. Sorry, there was a little bit of feedback there. Can everyone still hear me okay with that little bit of feedback? Yeah, okay, great. And then of course, as part of your design, you know, we mustn't forget that we must meet the trading rules as well. So trading rules are designed to ensure that habitats are not replaced with those with lower value habitats. And of course, there are no trade-offs between the three categories in the metric as well. So habitats, hedgerows, and watercourses. So if you're having to lose hedgerows, you will need to replace that with hedgerows. You can't replace that with a pond or any other different habitat. And at this stage as well, you know, it is really important to consider your management techniques. You know, for example, certain grass areas may need cutting less often or need cuttings taken away. So we'll need to understand, you know, the volume of those cuttings, how often those cuttings will need to be taken off. And of course, the big one is, you know, where on earth are those cuttings going to go? Another big consideration is access as well to those management areas. Can you get the necessary machinery on site? Have you got the appropriate routes? So of course, you're not disturbing any other habitat that you've been able to enhance or create on site. And then we come to the implementation stage. So construction teams are, of course, you know, very used to protection measures, but BNG does elevate this. You know, landscaping is now a delivery mechanism for BNG. So the correct care and treatment of landscaped areas is really important to enable habitats to establish well enough to have a chance of getting to that target condition that was committed to at planning. Think about any additional training that might be needed within your teams. You know, there is likely to be a shift in the type of habitat delivered on site or management techniques. So it's important to talk to your management companies. You know, are they ready for this? Are they engaged with BNG? And those that are engaged may well have their own due diligence procedures that may include changes to site handovers perhaps, or maybe even review of metrics before taking on sites, you know, and all of this heightens the importance of getting BNG right on the ground. Of course, there's not forgetting the legally securing BNG land through a planning obligation, or of course a conservation covenant for that minimum period of the 30 years. There's the National Register as well. So whilst the application process for the National Register is for off-site games, government are looking at ways to extract on-site information from that planning process. So again, that just heightens, you know, the transparent and accountability spirit of BNG. So it is an important consideration. And then we come to our operational stage, you know, and at the end of the day, you know, it's our communities, it's our residents that are going to be enjoying these spaces. And the more they understand why some areas may look different to that expected norm, the more engaged they're likely to be, the more accepting they're likely to be. So stakeholder engagement undertaken as part of scoping and design will help massively towards this, and help us understand what customers are looking for, you know, as we work through the regions. And of course, that operational stage includes that all-important management and monitoring to deliver those promised gains. And the first thing to highlight when we talk about on-site habitats is if these are significant. So in the government consultation response earlier in the year, they indicated that there will be a separation of on-site habitats into significant and those of less significance. A definition of what terms significant habitat is expected within up-and-coming guidance, but we understand at this stage that these significant habitats are likely to be secured for the minimum 30-year period, with that commencement date starting after the development is completed. And then how other kind of less significant on-site habitats are dealt with is expected to be much in the same way that it is normal, as already, get my words out, normal practice, in that they're legally secured with suitable management arrangements, perhaps within landscaping plans. So in terms of management and monitoring, of course, this should be undertaken to assess the progress and achievement towards your targeted BNG. And of course, that includes any other biodiversity outcomes that you may have, such as protected species. And this is to be in the form of a habitat management and monitoring plan, which is supportive of those BNG outcomes. And it has to be, or it's really important that it's adapted to adjust to those monitoring outcomes and how the habitats are responding to the management techniques. Some tweaks may be needed along the way, so it's important to have that adaptiveness within your management plans. A management template is currently being tested, and whilst this is probably unlikely to be mandatory to use, it will be encouraged to provide consistency, which of course we're all trying to grab hold of at the moment. And of course, consistency does help LPAs. You know, LPAs have got quite a big task on their hands at the moment, dealing with this as of we. So the more that we can help them determine applications, the better hopefully that will be for everyone involved. So your habitat management plan should include, of course, your management regimes, your regularity of monitoring and reporting, and who's responsible. And failure to deliver on-site outcomes, of course, can result in enforcement. So, you know, BNG brings a real opportunity here to contribute to nature's recovery, improve people's mental wealth and their engagement with nature, and those wider strategic objectives for communities. You know, but this is only really possible if BNG is delivered effectively. So it's really important we try and get it right. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of overview of on-site delivery. I'll now hand back to Richard, and we'll look forward to answering some of your questions.
Brilliant, Melissa. Thank you very much for that. Now you can Okay, we're all on full screen again now. That was that was brilliant, really useful, and did elicit quite a few questions that started to come in through the chat. We'll have a look at those questions, have a bit of discussion. That we often find that encourages more questions as well. What I'll try to do, the only problem with this sort of format, it's all a bit one way. We've got a question come in. For those that have written a question, you want to try to do a follow-up, pop it in. I'll try to keep my eyes open. If there's another question on the same topic, I'm going to try to feed it in that way. So as I said, for those that are joining later, just pop your questions in the Q&A function here, and then we'll encourage discussion and debate around it. But brilliant, thanks very much for that, Melissa. Our first question though comes from Penny. Thank you very much for sending us this awkward question that we know we can't answer it correctly, but I'll put it to you and we'll have a bit of a discussion anyway around that. So Penny does ask, what is the likelihood that the start date of November 2023 will be pushed back? There's still no secondary legislation from DEFRA, which is very concerning. Nick, I'll put you on the spot and see if you're going to have a first stab at that one.
So all I can say is that the government is saying it's still November, and there's a lot of work going on within DEFRA and the Department for Levelling Up to kind of get these secondary legislation kind of completed and out, as well as guidance as well. I'm sorry, Penny, I can't offer much more than that, other than just to say that that's the date we're all still working to.
Yeah, that's my understanding too, Nick. And I suppose the point is, obviously clearly that 6 months ago or something, I think they were telling us a different timeline. But as members of the hub, if you are members of the hub, you want to know about what's going on, we have got the oversight group, and there we do discuss and debate what are the particular challenges and the priority areas to discuss. And then we have conversations with DEFRA, and Nick's involved with these discussions as well, and we can start to advise at least where the development community are identifying the key issues that are around, and hopefully that they can be addressed as a priority by DEFRA as they start to produce guidance as it comes out. So we're having discussions, but as the likelihood of the start date, I think it's going to come out in November 2023.
And just to add to that as well, Richard, I think, Nick, you've mentioned previously that they're hopefully working on some transitional arrangements as well. So of course we need to try and think about when we're likely to get the detail. We need to absorb that information, and then obviously instruct and train teams, etc. accordingly. So
there has been a change in that regard. So previously themselves count towards biodiversity net gain, and the reason they don't is it's based on habitats that these species need. So without the habitats, they're not getting any extra benefit. So biodiversity net gain focuses on the habitats, but that's not to say that but designing in Swift bricks into a building isn't a bad thing. It is a good thing to do. It's just for purely BNG purposes, it doesn't count towards the overall BNG calculation.
Alex, do you have something to add?
I just had a quick because the question kind of raised green walls, and green walls, yes, obviously they do count. However, it's worth bearing in mind, particularly at the design stage, about who's going to be actually looking after those sorts of features. If they're within private curtilage, it can be quite difficult to keep that separate from what's actually within private ownership, given that the vast majority of management on site is going to take place by a residence management company. Those features can be designed in, but their management needs to be considered in the long term, in terms of access, in terms of whatever it might be. If it's within private areas, stuff like trees in back gardens, they can't always be guaranteed for that long period of time.
You raised a challenge, I suppose. What's the solution to that?
I think the solution is in terms of the wider site landscaping. If we've got features like green walls, if they're going to be on areas that are, so if there's the provision for a local centre, for example, I think that sort of feature can work quite well where it's openly accessible. Where it starts to become within private curtilage, there's a difficulty in terms of how that's preserved through handover documents to a homeowner and so on. So it's about making sure that what's within plot curtilage is considered correctly in terms of the condition it can achieve and what it can what you can feasibly include in there that can be managed readily by a homeowner themselves.
And that highlights the point, doesn't it, Alex, of actually being realistic in what you can actually bring to site. There's quite a lot of elements that we need to bring into development. So yeah, things that need particular type of management or are subject to being a high value habitat that demands or needs, for that habitat function, needs a relatively high score in terms of condition. Then yeah, it's that realism point, isn't it? Yeah, because otherwise you'll just fail in delivery, and nobody wants that.
The other point to mention here as well is within the metric, the private gardens, the way it scores, it assumes a failure rate based on the fact that data we've got around how many gardens get lost to decking, for example, over timeframes within London and elsewhere. So in the scenario that Alex described, where you may have kind of a particular feature within a private garden, you're probably best just describing it as a private garden. It gets a value within the metric, but it's a relatively low value, and that's because there isn't that ability to actually go in and guarantee the onward management. It may be brilliant over time, it may get lost entirely to a shed. So the kind of metric is accounted for that.
And that's where the work that Alex and I are doing with obviously me with Persimmon and Alex with Barratt, we can work to encourage people to be as wildlife friendly as possible, and all that helps as well, doesn't it? It's a bit more of a more wider reaching view as well, isn't it? And this comes back to the point of the metric is a tool. It helps us to evidence the outcomes, but we can do a lot more behind the scenes as well.
Well, that Melissa, that feeds very nicely into one of our next questions, actually, which is about residents and how they put. But given there's encouragement to engage with stakeholders and listen to what they'd like to see, what should we do when residents prefer a mown grass lawn than a higher distinctiveness grassland, when there are other clear contradictions between what residents would like to see and what delivers for nature? Yeah, and this is one of the challenges on site. That there is that both nature and recreation need space. And nature does very well without with minimal disturbance as possible. And it just comes back to that education and just engaging with customers, understanding what they want, which can be very regionally different. And also just, training, I guess, and just some support and guidance for those people on the ground. So your sales teams and those engaging directly with customers, they also play a massive part in being able to talk through these situations with customers so that they completely understand. It's also all about managing expectations, isn't it? I guess they can understand why in the summer that wildflower area looked really nice, but then towards the end of the summer it didn't look as nice. But then it's understanding that why that is, the benefits to biodiversity, the benefits it brings to that community, and also when that space will be managed, because it will be managed. It's just a case of when that will happen.
Just to add to that very quickly, I think so. That's a really good point. Actually, I think there's two real big parts of this, isn't there? There's how and where you zone different habitats in the context of a site, because there will always be the need for formal POS. Green space officers will have an expectation of what qualifies as public open space, but there are also opportunities to use less focal areas of a development for this sort of habitat creation. And the point that Melissa makes around interpretation is really, really key. We were doing a lot of work with our sales and marketing teams. There's a lot more to be done to kind of improve that understanding when somebody steps into a sales arena, what's going to be delivered on the site in the long term. And that's kind of quite direct involvement. But the use of stuff like interpretation boards or whatever it might be, signage that acts as passive comms and passive interpretation long after a development might have shut down in sales terms, will help both existing and new residents, if they do move in, understand what the expectations are. And it limits that awkwardness where, in terms of delivery, that sometimes you hear stories of management companies being pressured by residents while they're actually on site to just mow that bit of lawn down. And in the future for BNG, that might have quite a considerable effect on the long-term delivery of what was agreed at planning. So it's really, really key that those things are understood when, all along the customer journey and when they've, long after they've moved in.
And I think there's a lot to be learned as well here from parks and green space managers who've also been kind of grappling with this for many years now as well, in terms of how do you kind of create a space that has a kind of public amenity value, looks like it's being managed and maintained because people are, don't want to feel that a place is falling into disrepair, but is actually you've created still areas of habitat, potentially out of kind of high footfall areas or kind of out of sight lines, or where they are in view. Just making sure that there's some explanation to say why it's like it as well. It's not that no one's managing that space, actually it's being quite deliberately managed, but for nature.
Yeah, and that forms part of a big part of your design strategy, doesn't it? Bring those expertise along the design journey with you. You wouldn't probably ask any of us to create a master plan. We'd probably give it a really good go, but you probably wouldn't get the best outcome. And that's the same for designing in ecology or designing your developments around ecology. You need to get those expertise in that can help you with those things.
Brilliant. So I suppose follow-up question, that's about sort of residents' expectations, but about residents' duties. And we had, this was one of the earlier questions I got from Richard Marsh, I think it was. Yeah, so Richard asked the question really about the long-term management. So if the developer's not funding the 30-year management plan and monitoring, what do you consider is the best way to ensure funds are secured for the minimum 30-year period to implement the management plan? Alex?
I think there's a few different mechanisms by which that funding can be secured, and a lot of developers, will appoint a management company whilst the site's still under their control, and that's there is the option for a residence management company to be formed. I think that in the main, that kind of long-term funding, as now, would be secured through service charge payments to a management company. But it's really important for management companies who take on that responsibility, whether it's an RMC or one that's been appointed, that there is a need for that kind of, or there may be a need for that continual investment in the green space, without which the management type frequency might end up being cut. We won't actually achieve what was set out to be achieved.
And I guess as well, it's we've talked about this a lot, but it's all about engaging with the right people again, isn't it? So engaging with those right companies. If it is a resident management company, it's just ensuring that they understand what needs to be delivered and why it needs to be delivered, and that they understand, because habitat management for conservation for nature is very different to other types of habitat management. So ensuring that they understand that it's all set within contracts appropriately, will be a big thing towards the right outcome.
The other thing possibly worth mentioning as well is, it's, as Melissa says, it is quite different, but it doesn't necessarily have to be more expensive. So typically there's less intervention required as well, so there's less frequency of mowing, etc. So potentially there can be kind of savings as well in terms of the way the management is actually delivered for BNG compared to more traditional management approaches.
Okay, thank you. I've got sort of a question here, but I think it's almost a suggestion that goes back to the discussion we were having about residents. So Luke Bamforth asked the question, but would it be worth linking customers with local nature organisations to continue that education and engagement in the long term? It sounds like a sensible suggestion. Is that something you do, Alex, Melissa?
We don't directly on every development link with local nature organisations, but we funded an RSPB project because we have a corporate partnership with RSPB to fund the Nature on Your Doorstep project. So that aims to encourage, it's not just for Barratt homeowners, it's for everybody, it's kind of openly accessible. But the idea behind that was to sort of drive local involvement and engagement with nature. It might be more wildlife friendly gardening practices. It might be ways in which people could get more involved with learning about protected species or habitats in their local area. And the idea was that that the project would run for a few years. It's still running now, but thereafter there'd be a kind of a bit more of an organic growth of that kind of involvement and engagement at a local level. I still think it's a valid point. If there's an opportunity to do that, it might be something which is, if it requires the involvement of a conservation NGO, for example, better suited to a larger scale development where there's perhaps a bit more larger body of residents. But it's not to say that, you know, existing residents in the local area couldn't get involved as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And how fabulous will that be? You know, you think of the families, don't you, in the communities that we're building, and how fabulous that will be for those families and their children engaging with nature. And, you know, they're the ones that are going to be, you know, they're the future generations, aren't they? So yeah, wherever you can do that, definitely.
Okay, brilliant. Right, a couple of, I think these are sort of quicker ones to answer, but let's try this one. So I think it's another sort of metric calculation, but can I aggregate my BNG over a number of sites, Nick?
No. If it's a phased development, that's different. So then the BNG applies across the totality of the phases, and you'd need to do a kind of set out a kind of delivery plan and what percentage each phase is going to deliver. But no, you can't if it's just aggregating.
Okay. And another one, most might be quick, but 30 years to commence after the development is completed. But when is that completion date? Is there a definition? I'll put it to you. I've got one, Melissa. Sorry, you were nodding there.
Yeah. So we are. This is not entirely. I mean, Nick might correct me here, but it's not entirely clear at the moment. You know, of course, completion of development can mean so many things, and that it might be different for the size of development that you're referring to as well. So we are actually waiting for a little bit more clarification on this just yet. But yeah, I don't know whether you want to add to that, Nick.
Just to add that there is guidance that will be coming on this, and yes, there will be differences depending on the nature of the development. So obviously, going back to what I was saying a second ago, if it's a phased development, then the final completion may be kind of many years away, but actually it will relate to the particular phase that particular bit of BNG was being applied to. But yeah, we are waiting on guidance from government on this.
Okay. One, I think guidance has been published on stacking, but a question from Luke Bamforth, and it says a follow-up. Jonathan says follow-up. I think it might be from the previous question, so I'll ask the two together. So the first question is, what wider strategic objectives can BNG count towards? For example, can SUDS and other green infrastructure count towards BNG target? But the follow-up, which I think is involved, so I can see BNG could work very well to improve other ecology mitigation work. On-site habitat delivery of great crested newt for district level licenses. Other species will have similar schemes under the Environmental Act. Will this be integrated with BNG? Who wants to take that? Nick, do you want to?
Yeah, no, happy to. And Melissa touched on this a kind of short while ago as well. So, so provision of green infrastructure on site and the kind of features, any features that are found in the metric, and most of them are, can kind of fully count towards BNG. So SUDS, green walls and roofs, as we've talked about. When it comes to species mitigation measures, so habitat features for great crested newts or for bats, etc., then yes, they can count towards BNG, but they get capped at a level no greater than no net loss. So you'll always have to do something slightly further. But if you're having to do these things anyway as part of your kind of requirements for the development, yes, it is contributing as well to the BNG requirement.
Brilliant. And I think another relatively quick answer here, if you do know, but how long will a baseline assessment last for? Will a baseline assessment done 2 to 3 years ago still be relevant, and can it be used?
It can depend to an extent really on the nature of the site. So, so if it's a site of pretty low existing baseline value 2 to 3 years ago, yeah, that's probably still fine. But if it's a site where actually the baseline indicated that there were important habitats on site, it would be advisable to come revisit that. I suspect your planning authority will help take a view on this as well, in terms of whether they're comfortable with an assessment that was a couple of years old or wanted a fresh one. And there's also industry guidance out on this, I think, published by SAIM and others.
Okay, good. So some quick fire ones. I think this one might have a bit more debate around it, but it says I suppose the way it's phrased is slightly, but it says developers need to be given guidance on the types of habitats that can be created on a development site. Creating high-value habitats on a development site needs a lot of thought. In the majority of instances, it's not realistic. I suppose the discussion is just that. What is, what is good good advice about the types of habitats that can be created on these sites? Melissa, do you want to?
Yeah, and Alex touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's if you, as part of your they're quite right in bringing that comment up, and this is about, again, being realistic, isn't it? So it's all about engaging with people that understand habitat, the habitat function, and how that's applied in the metric to give you the best outcome. And I think we've probably all got examples of metrics that we've opened and we've been a little bit shocked by perhaps what's in there. And when you actually think about the interaction and the site activity levels, and you apply that ecological know-how to the metric, a site that you've got your landscaping plan hasn't changed, but just that ecological insight will give you, you might have a difference in your percentage may be quite different. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, you can't always, with the disturbance levels maybe on site, you can't always target that higher condition. So it's about maybe segregating those particular areas from the less areas of activity, and dealing with it in that way. Yeah.
I may just add a couple of points as well. I think it's all well and good providing developers with this kind of guidance, but that we will always lean on ecology consultants for their professional opinion. And the point around the metric being a tool to help measure this, there is still that need for that professional opinion, like Melissa says. However, we have got the habitat condition assessment sheets as well, and I know that the purpose of those is not to kind of guide management prescription, but if you look at what's possible or what's required to achieve moderate or good conditions for some of the more difficult or or long-term habitats, there is also that point to make about, can you technically achieve it? For example, the orchards, traditional orchard, to achieve good, you have to have veteran trees present. You can't do that in 30 years, or it's very, very unlikely that you're going to be able to do that in 30 years. So can you ever get that into good conditions? So it's just about having a view of that. But again, that should still really be the preserve of ecology consultants. I think it's not necessary for a development technical team to understand the nuances that are behind how these things are worked out.
Yeah, as a general rule of thumb, if you're thinking about trying to deliver very high quality habitats within a development footprint, think long and hard about, actually, is that doable or not? And in many instances, it would be better delivered off site. That's not to say, though, that there's not a lot that can be done within your development site. And actually, in most instances, you won't necessarily need to deliver those really high quality habitats anyway, because if Melissa talked about the trading rules before, most development impacts habitats of relatively low value, and you can improve that. You can deliver a better quality outcome without necessarily delivering really high quality habitats as well. It's your choice if you want to do that. The metric will tell you what the minimum you have to do is, and in many instances what it's just talking about are outcomes that are still feasible within your red line.
Okay, thank you, Nick. I think on similar topic, which is about the actual management or on site, but I think it goes back to your point that you might have made it, Melissa, about the due diligence and training for maintenance contractors. So is there any guidance or recommended training for providers for this?
Not to my knowledge. Again, you guys might correct me on that, but not to my knowledge. But it is just about engaging with those and just making sure that they do understand, and probably engaging with them early doors as well, so the habitats that you are providing, particularly if they are the more higher condition habitats, do the management companies agree with that? Can they actually go ahead with that? Can they physically deliver that on site as well? So yeah, I think it's about early engagement again.
I think there's a bit of work we've been doing about a bit of work with the likes of Barley and the Landscape Institute to see what their members are expecting as well, and see if it's just gauge the landscape industry understanding of what the requirements are. So there's possibly an argument that there should be a bit of a crossover or a link up between the likes of CIE and the sort of landscape industries, just to level the expectation and understanding of what will be required when BNG becomes mandatory.
Yeah, and just linked to so what Alex was saying there as well. So there's training we've done with the Landscape Institute as part of their kind of CPD courses that they've been doing for landscape professionals. There's also a work happening now with bodies like the Property Institute and others as well through Barratt and others to try and kind of upskill maintenance contractors, gardeners, others as well, because this is quite new to them. But on the plus side, it's also potentially a kind of bid winning opportunity for them as well, because if they can demonstrate, and to be fair, a number of them can, that actually they're able to do this, then potentially it puts them in good stead when it comes to winning work as well, because this will be something that developers will be looking for from them.
Well, follow-up question is going from there, looking at the smallest of sites though. So what's the best way of delivering management and monitoring of BNG on small sites for 30 years? So if it's on a small site with 1 or 2 dwellings, where the surrounding land is in the curtilage of the private dwellings, is this the responsibility of the homeowner?
So this is, again, a lot will depend on how valuable for biodiversity the site baseline was in the first instance. Many of these won't be that valuable, but some will. So in an instance where the actual original site wasn't of particularly high biodiversity value, then features such as private gardens, kind of hedgerows, kind of other kind of small scale features may be sufficient on site. Where it's not, this is potentially where off-site habitat banks come into their own, because quite often you'll be looking for small numbers or even fractions of units that you need to make up your 10%. And that's what they're designed kind of to set up to provide as well. So we're encouraging the provision of these habitat banks where people do need to go off-site. But in a number of instances, actually it's still possible, but it does come back to what was the nature of the site in the first instance. And we're talking to bodies like REBA as well, because we appreciate many of these small developments will often get their advice from the architects. So talking with architects as well around BNG and opportunities to try and integrate it on site if they can.
Okay. This is actually looking at the number of questions. It's sort of how to actually manage and maintain, and the sort of structures around it is coming up quite frequently. I've got one here from Adam and Ralph. Given the difficulties and risks associated with handling complex green infrastructure to resident management companies. Oh, sorry, something's just popped up my screen. I can't see that now. Okay, so given the difficulties and risks associated with handing these to resident management companies, what other governance structures could be considered more appropriate to secure long-term stewardship and on-site gains? And we touched on a little bit before about sort of management companies themselves, but are there what other options are available? No one. I'll give it to you, Alex. No one jumped in to answer that one. It's obviously quite complex.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. I think could in this case conservation covenants come into it, Nick, at all, or is that purely for offsite?
Potentially, it's also a discussion that is being run through other bodies as well, like the Town and Country Planning Association and the UK Green Infrastructure Partnership. It's not a new challenge necessarily either. So there are different approaches that have been trialed around the country. I don't think there's a kind of consensus yet as well. And it would be, actually, if I can turn the question back to those on the call, it would be really interesting if people have got thoughts and ideas themselves as well to please do kind of put those in the Q&A on this one.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think so. Just looking at the time, should we squeeze out? I think we squeeze in 1 or 2 very quick ones, only because there's a follow-up question to the point you made about aggregation, Nick. So this was about, that was about stacking. So I thought it might be about the using, anyway, the question is it possible to use surplus units from one development as the offsite offset for another?
Yes, it is
Yeah.
going to be possible to do that. They'll need to be treated as fully offsite, so they will need to be registered on the National Register. They'll need to be legally secured, etc. But yes, it is possible.
Okay. Thank you. And one more that's put to you as well, Nick. Are there any specific details in the guidance which prevent developers/landowners or even local authorities themselves from building on sites of ecological importance?
Yes, one of the purposes for the register is where things are being delivered off-site, that information is on the National Register. So it doesn't prevent a off-site site being developed upon if the local authority approves that, but it means its baseline value will be set at what it was supposed to have been delivering as a biodiversity gain outcome as well. So, so there is stuff in place off-site. On site, it's the usual in terms of, obviously you still need to kind of get the agreement with the planning authority, etc.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that, Nick. And thank you, Alex and Melissa. That was a really interesting and insightful chat. And to be honest, I think we almost got through all of the questions, or at least the key topics that were within the question set. So I'm very pleased with that. There were some other sort of outstanding queries, which I think related to guidance and a bit more technical queries as well. I think Nick would probably encourage you to read the guidance themselves, but there is an email address for Natural England, is there not, Nick, for those who've got specific queries?
There is. There's an email address relating to the metric if you're having particular technical issues with the metric that you need assistance with, and I'm just trying to remind myself what the address is.
Well,
so
we can circulate that to the members.
It's biodiversitymetric@naturalenengland.org.uk, but I will put it in the...
Excellent. I can see it in there. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for your questions as well. It's been a really useful discussion and very interesting debate. So we'll probably have one more of these at least, seeing the popularity of these clinics, and we'll set one up and circulate dates for them in due course. Okay, thanks all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much.